Hello, welcome to Books and Brews,
the place where beer and literature meet.
with your host, the seer of the beer, Chris Powell.
And Laura Vosica, author of the Bluebells Chronicles.
Each month, we invite a guest author to read their works and talk about writing while sipping a beer specially paired to their work.
Today's guest is JP Reedman.
So sit back,
Pop a cold one,
and dive into some books.
and brews.
Welcome to episode number 68 of Books and Brews with JP Reedman. So, Laura, what have you been doing this month?
I always have to write down what the month was like because the days are just a blur. We've been out fencing. Our farm helper, Dustin, and I, we've been building fences. We've been building a sheep shelter. Oh, we went to the Nashville Book Festival. That was kind of fun. Had a lot of people waving our medieval sword, wearing our medieval helmet, which is right up our guest's alley. And what did you do that I also did with you?
Well, we went to go see the homecoming of the Kentucky Colonels up in Louisville. I'm a Kentucky Colonel, and we got to go meet lots of other Kentucky Colonels and have a wonderful time. We actually got to go to Churchill Downs and bet on the horses.
You should explain what a Kentucky Colonel is.
Yes. Well, officially, it dates back to like 1829. It's an official aide-de-camp of the governor of Kentucky. And actually, we can be called up militarily if that would ever happen. But basically, as an aide-de-camp of the governor, we're primarily interested in charitable works and things like that. We're helping to spread the message of Kentucky, and all of that kind of a thing. So we do get to call ourselves a colonel. We get to put that on business cards.
It's a legal title.
Yes,
Yep.
and we're also honorables as well, which is very interesting. But it's, I think, because it dates back so far. So in any event, we had a wonderful time. And at Churchill Downs, all the women wore hats and all the men were wearing wonderful suits. I happened to have my seersucker suit, and life was good. So it was a lot of fun.
He got called Colonel Sanders a couple of times.
Yes, because of the seersucker suit and the combination of the beard.
Right.
But other than that, I bear no resemblance.
Did you get any reading done?
The reading I get done is associated with work. But how about yourself? Did you get anything interesting read?
I read the title. I had great plans to read the rest of it. I still do. This is Foraging for Wild Foods. Now, for those of you who remember Michael Agnew, he was a master forager of mushrooms. And that always scares me, especially the more you read about foraging food and how many foods do have lookalikes. So, but I figured I can at least start reading if I ever get time.
Well, in the meantime, who is our guest this month, Laura?
I thought you'd never ask. Coming all the way from England, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, coming all the way from England is JP Reedman. She lives in Wiltshire near Stonehenge. Born in Canada, she has had a lifelong interest in ancient and medieval history and is often found lurking around, right, like someone else, and is often found lurking around prehistoric sites, ruined castles and abbeys. And I like the use of the word lurking. It gives me a very specific image of you peering around a stone, maybe. And interesting churches with camera in hand. That sounds like something I would do. She became a full-time writer in 2018. Her series include Richard Plantagenet. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah.
5 books chronicling Richard's life from childhood to Bosworth and Medieval Babes, a set of standalone novels about lesser-known medieval queens and noblewomen. Her most recent release is Princess in the Police Station, which is a fascinating title. The Tale of Little Anne Mowbray, wife of the younger prince in the Tower, which I need to remember to ask you about that, whose grave was unexpectedly found in the 1960s. The next book to be released will be The Melancholy of Winter, which we will be hearing from today.
Well, I have to ask, does Christina McQuarrie count as a medieval babe?
Yeah, have you ever written about Christina McRory?
I haven't yet. Who is
Oh,
she? Tell me who that is.
Yes, she was the
she's
equivalent of an earl in
yeah.
Scotland in that time, and was also quite apparently, very good looking,
Well,
according to your books.
at least according to Nigel Tranter, Robert the Bruce found her quite enticing.
Yes.
I've always wondered if he had any reason to believe that or not, but that's the way he wrote this story. Anyway, The Melancholy of Winter is about Edmund of Rutland, Richard's tragic elder brother. So, welcome, JP. And do you go more by JP, or can I call you by your first name for the interview?
Yeah, my name is Janet. You can call me Janet.
All right. Fantastic. So that means we are ready for drink one.
So the first cocktail I have for your first reading is a cocktail called the Medicine for Melancholy, since your book is called The Melancholy of Winter. And actually, what's interesting about this, I was reading about the shadow, the storms, the snow, the father who has money worries and all of this. And it made me think back to artists and composers of the early 19th century who ended up getting drunk in absinthe bars quite a bit, because absinthe was cheap, and it could actually, because of the two-jone, the active ingredient in wormwood, could create some sort of hallucinatory experience. So I thought, well, what better to deal with melancholy than, a wonderful cocktail as medicine for it. So the first thing I've put together, I have 4 cucumber slices that I mulled in here and threw and threw some ice in on top of it. I have some vodka, and I have some basil simple syrup that's about to go in. We've already got lime juice and Saint Germain in here. So a simple syrup, this is just a sugar syrup, and I took some basil paste and I muddled this in as well. So here I have the simple syrup with basil in it, which I'm going to add to the shaker that I've already got. And then the interesting thing about this drink, absinthe is fairly strong with the tastes from wormwood and anise and other types of flavors. It can really impose its own will on a cocktail. So with this cocktail, what we're doing is we actually are going to use an absinthe rinse. So we're just taking the absinthe and rinsing it around the inside of the glass, and then we toss it. So I now have everything in the shaker, and I will strain this into our absinthe rinsed glass. And I can already smell some of that wonderful anise smell that absinthe has, which is going to impart, kind of a neat flavor, I think, to the drink. So here we have a lot going on. We've got basil, we've got Saint Germain with the elderflower kind of component to it, the cucumber aspect to things, and now a little bit of absinthe. So I will give this to Laura. Here we have the Medicine for Melancholy in relation to your first reading. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers, guys.
That is really good.
Isn't that got a neat flavor? You can really taste everything coming through that.
Yeah. Yeah, I would highly recommend this. What is all the little spice looking stuff floating in there?
That's the basil I muddled in with the simple syrup.
And we brewed the basil ourselves. So this is like really almost homemade, apart from the absinthe and the rest of it.
Right, yeah, apart from all those other things and the vodka.
So go ahead with reading number 1.
Okay, here's reading number 1. And that looks like a brilliant drink, by the way.
It's delicious.
It was a season of shadows, storms, and snow. Big Ned and I raced around the castle, play fighting in our warm woolen cloaks, or else we went into the town market with Tag. We watched boys skate on the frozen river with envious eyes. We were not permitted, of course. Edward begged Tad to let us try skating just one time, that naught untoward would happen, that our father would never know, but our tutor put down his foot and refused. I've let you two get away with more than I should have, he said, grimmer than we'd ever seen him. If it was known I'd let you risk injury or worse, he looked over the shoulder at the 4 massive cornet turrets of Trim Castle's keep. Birds were sailing above them, screaming, your sire would have my head off in a trice, and up there on a spike. No, he would not, I insisted, but then flushed, for I was lying. If Ned or I were harmed while under Tag's watch, he would pay a dire penalty, even if we both had begged to let him have our own way. So skating was thrust to the back of our minds, and we turned to the indoor pastimes common in winter: marbles and hoodman's blind, draughts and chess. Ned usually won the chess. He was an excellent strategist. But I improved daily if I concentrated very hard. We also pored over the pages of a huge bestiary filled with illustrations of wild and exotic animals, including the hairy four-footed behemoth, an elephant with a tower full of archers on its back, a monoceros which had a single horn like a unicorn's but was ugly, and a sea monk, which was a fish that resembled a tonsured monk. We hoped that, in kinder times, we might be able to see the real beasts at the Tower of London, where they had numerous animals given as gifts by foreign rulers. Sadly, the menagerie was somewhat depleted right now, since the lions, the most noble of the tower's occupants, had died off several years ago, and their keeper, one William Kirby, was relieved of his position. Close confined, owing to the inclement weather, it snowed or rained every day, and once we even woke to find everything, trees, walls, fields, coated with ice. Ned and I began to notice that father seemed less content, less satisfied than when we first arrived in Ireland. "What do you think is wrong?" I whispered to Big Ned as we watched father stride through the smoky great hall, not even noticing that his two eldest sons were present. His brow was furrowed beneath his velvet chaperon. His lips were stretched in a grim line. "You won't tell anyone?" "Of course not. I'm not a tittle-tattle." "Well, it's money worries. He has received no money from King Henry, although he was promised his wages. He needs to raise levies, but the law forbids it. There's no other way to keep the peace. Father fears some of the clans are eager for war, despite their fair words in Parliament." "How did you find this out?" He shrugged, but his cheek picked a little. "Earwigger," I nudged him in the ribs. "You were listening at the chamber door. Someone had to do it." And that's part one.
Did you get to walk that area in Lindisfarne where the tide comes in and out very dramatically?
Yes, yes, I did. Of course, I made sure that I wasn't going to get trapped. Because a friend of mine years ago, as a child, she actually went up with her parents, and they sort of missed the last time, and they had to be rescued.
Oh no.
Oh, they didn't make it to one of the boxes that were up on poles?
Yeah, they just got to the box, and they had to come and get them in a boat.
They just got to wait till the next tide goes out,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
really curious how that happens. Did they not look at the timetables? Because the reason I ask is because we stood on the shore watching, and it seemed to me like it took forever. Even when they say, you better be out by 8. It was 38:45 before it was really full,
Really, really high. I don't know how they did it, whether because it were, the kids and their parents, and the kids got playing, and the parents got busy taking photos and things like that, and suddenly realized, oh, we thought it was this time. It's later than that.
So were they up in the box with their kids?
Yes, they actually got up into the box, and then they had to get a little boat came out and got them. There's another time.
Were the kids terrified, or did they just think it was a great adventure?
Well, my friend, she said that first they were laughing, then they got a bit scared.
Mm-hmm.
But once they saw the box, though, and they were able to get into the box, they knew they were going to be above the water no matter what.
Right.
Hopefully they rewarded the boat owner with a pint at the pub or something something.
Oh, yes, I'm sure they did.
Right. The reason we were at Lindisfarne is because the very last scene in my entire series, well, it's close to the last scene anyway, does take place there. And the premise of the scene has to do with the fact that the tide comes in so high, whereas there's nothing, during low tide. So I was kind of using that in the last scene. So yeah, as I was reading your reading, one of the things that crossed my mind was you do use a lot of terms, and I do too. What were some of them? Bestiary, chaperone for the kind of hat, tonsure. I think most people know what a tonsure is, but do you kind of explain things in context, or are your readers so familiar with historical fiction that they know what these things are?
Sometimes I will put in a little piece that describes what it is. If it's one that's like someone when I'm describing the kind of monsters that are in the bestiary, and
Uh-huh.
then I figure people already know they're some kind of creature. So, but yeah,
Right,
occasionally, sometimes I will, sometimes I won't. It depends what it is. Like you said, most people
right.
know what the monk's tonsure is, but not perhaps the other things.
Right. I, despite researching medieval history, I don't think I'd come across the term, is it pronounced chaperone?
Chaperon, yeah.
Chaperone. What exactly is
It,
that
it's
type
a
of a
it's a
hat?
man's hat. It's one you probably have seen it in sort of photos from or photos paintings from the 15th century. It's quite a large hat. They kind of wrapped a bit around it. Sometimes they had a piece hanging down, a bit like the lyre pipe of this from the century before, but instead went around the head. So it was kind of just
Okay.
a big, large hat.
Okay.
Sort of
It would have fit
before.
right in at Churchill Downs.
Yes, indeed.
We didn't see him there. So I was really interested that you set out to write fantasy.
I
And yet
did.
do you have like 32 novels out, I think?
About that, yeah.
About you lost count.
Yeah, the different variations of them, compilations and that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's got the two main series that I do, and then sort of little subsidiary ones. And I still have a fantasy novel sort of on the burner. I have to do these ones for obviously to keep my income going, but
Right, right.
I do
Well,
want to go back to fantasy at one point.
how did you end up from fantasy landing in historical fiction?
Well, I think when I first got into fantasy, there wasn't that much fantasy around. So the next best thing, if I couldn't find any, I was able to find historical medieval fiction. So I had
Mm-hmm,
to say castles, kings, swords, battles. So
mm-hmm,
that's how I did. I think it was probably the first one that I did like Rosemary Sutcliffe, who did young
mm-hmm,
adults. It was probably from the 60s onwards. I did like her things from sort of
mm-hmm.
from about the age of 12, 13 onwards. Then after that, in about 1983, I read the books of Sharon Penman, starting with The Sun in
Okay.
Splendor, which was about
Mm-hmm.
Richard III, which of course I also write about him. And at first I wasn't going to do it because I thought I can never compete with somebody like Sharon. I feel embarrassed to try.
Right.
But then I had a really different idea to go do the same story, but in a very different way. I decided to go for it in first person from
Okay.
his point of view.
Interesting. You know, this is fascinating. Because Sharon K. Penman is from England, correct?
No, she's actually American.
Oh, is she American? Okay, that
Yes,
makes a little
yes,
more sense. I think I've heard a lot of British authors talk about her.
yes, she's
That
very
might
highly
be.
regarded. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, one of my Facebook author friends who actually lived just down the street from me before we left Minneapolis actually became very good friends with Sharon K. Penman. And it developed into quite a close relationship that I think she's helping with something after since Sharon died. And I would have to check my details on what exactly that is, but professionally it became a very close relationship that I think started online. So it's kind of an interesting story, and I should go look more now.
Oh,
And I was
definitely.
really interested to hear that you were reading Beowulf and the Elder Edis. How do you
Yes,
pronounce
that's the old Scandinavian books of myths.
that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I said I've always had this sort of real inclination for the past, right from the time I was a very small child. I mean, I was
Hmm.
about 4 or 5 years old, and it was Cleopatra, and I would get these big picture books from the library. Even though I couldn't read them, I would look at the pictures. But my
Hmm.
sister was about 16 years older than me, and she would, of course, read them.
Oh,
And so I
that's
was also
nice.
getting that bit of
Yeah.
slightly more adult level. So I became a
Hmm.
pretty good reader very quickly.
Hmm. Who was the Elder Edis? I
Oh, oh,
I
I,
am not familiar with him, and it does surprise me because I think I'm fairly well versed, but maybe
yeah.
it's just outside
Well,
my
no,
range of
actually, that's
medieval
what the
history.
book was called. The author is
Okay.
Snorri Sturluson,
Hmm.
and he was an Icelandic man who lived in the Middle Ages, and he wrote down the Viking myths and legends with all the
Okay.
lists of names, and it's Tolkien used it obviously to take some of his names for the dwarves and for
Hmm.
Gandalf. Um,
Oh, very
yeah,
interesting.
Yeah. So
I bet that's a cool bit of trivia to Lord of the Rings lovers,
oh,
which
absolutely.
I think
Yeah.
all my boys are. Yeah, that's great. Well, I think we're ready for drink number 2.
Awesome. Alrighty. The drink that we have for reading number 2, regarding the bean and the cake, I just had a good time with this. And so there's a particular dirty martini called the Dilly Bean Dirty Martini. And so in this case, we're actually using pickled green beans. Obviously, the one in the reading is not going to be an enormous green bean, but this just had such a great, name, the Dilly Bean Dry Martini, that, I had to bring it to the table. And or dirty martini. A dirty martini has typically, in addition to the gin and the vermouth, has olive brine in it. And what we're going to use for this one is actually the pickled green bean brine, and then we'll make a drink from it. So we're going to be today using vodka actually for this one, just to give it a slightly more mellow flavor. And as with any martini, it's not like it's a mild drink. We're not looking at a Shirley Temple here or anything like that. This is a pretty stiff drink.
And I'm watching one after another go in.
That's right. Well, we have to fill up the glass. We can't just leave it half empty. That's just not very hospitable. So then we get our vermouth out. I had already gotten the amount of Dilly bean brine ready to go. It's not what you'd call a trivial amount. We'll just put it that way. And now we get to shake that. We pour that into a martini glass. And then, of course, it's not like we can leave the Dilly bean out of the picture. We are going to bring a couple of them in for a garnish. And I know Laura's not the biggest fan of green beans, so I only put one in hers. But one does not need to eat the garnish either. So here we have the Dilly Bean Dirty Martini to go with your second reading.
Something tells me I'm not really one for salty drinks. So something tells me I'm not going to be a huge fan of this. But Laura really does like salty drinks. So
brine, though, that's a little intimidating.
Cheers.
Okay, the Dilly Bean. I feel like I'm obligated to at least try it.
Okay. Yeah, that's not an easy one to drink. And she hasn't even tried to drink it yet. She's just been munching on the bean.
That's just the bean. That's like drinking a tub of brine.
It really is, yes. And some people probably like this, but hey, we found the bean in the cake, so we're off to reading number 2.
And I think the bean in the cake is not quite like a green bean, is it? It's more like, what, a kidney bean or something?
More like a kidney bean.
Okay.
But I had some fun with this anyway, so
go ahead with reading number 2, and may I not make a sour IPA face after your reading.
Reading number 2, which is at Twelfth Night, which is one of the great 12 days that they celebrated Christmas. Twelfth Night arrived, the final day of the Christmas festivities. Another lavish feast was held, and our less than pleasant brother by marriage was present. The trenchers were heaped high with boar meat, salmon, crayfish, and eels, though I could not bear looking at the latter. Some had their heads left on, and their toothy maws resembled the hellmouth depicted in prayer books and on church walls. Some years ago, the earlier Feast of Fools had been abolished by the church. Much to my chagrin, it sounded like a merry time was had by all but the sourest of priests. But some of its pastimes had grafted themselves onto Twelfth Night. Mummers were cavorting around the hall in wooden masks, some dressed as women, others as beasts. The chaplain had come and was intoning his predictions for the coming year. This was not considered blasphemous or sorcery, as one might think, but we were assured, purely based on the divination found in the Bible, which could foretell events in the natural world. There was a rainbow above the castle in the day of our Lord's birth, said the priest, which is a sign of hope and promise in a Christ. However, the winds on the battlements were also fierce and blew from the north. Such winds are said to betoken a year of hardship for men of station and power. I shall weather any such storms, boasted Henry Holland. He was nursing a large goblet of wine, about his 6th that eve. I'm sure that other's stars may descend. He reached over and snatched a piece of cake from a platter that was being carried around by the servers and inelegantly thrust it into his mouth, leaving a haze of crumbs on his lip. Suddenly he stopped, his eyes growing wide. Maybe he's choking on it, Edward whispered to me, hopeful. But Henry rose from his seat, fishing in his mouth with a finger. I have it, he cried. What now? Has one of his teeth fallen out? I mused. Henry was waving around something he held between his thumb and forefinger. I have it, the bean! He had found a bean hidden in his cake, and that was not any old bean. It was the one that gave its finder a title for the night, the Lord of Misrule. Ned and I nearly groaned at the thought, for the Lord of Misrule was permitted for that evening only to order the other 12th night celebrants to do whatever he commanded.
That's wonderful.
Right.
As hideous as the drink was.
It sounds like
wonderful as
Henry
the reading
Holland
was.
is just as hideous.
Yes,
Um,
and he gets his just desserts shortly after.
and I'm going to assume Henry Holland is a historical figure.
Yes, he is. Yeah, Duke of
And
Exeter.
was he a hideous person?
He was a hideous person.
Okay.
Yeah, he was married into the York family. He married their daughter Anne, and this was, of course, the usual political alliance. But he quickly proved himself to be sort of very warlike and quite violent. He was known even on his own side as being quite violent. And
Okay.
of course, so immediately there was this huge separation, but had to be sort of nice to him because he was still married to their daughter.
Okay, so he is the brother by marriage that's referred
He's the
to at
brother
the
by
beginning.
marriage.
Okay, I didn't get that, but I'm assuming readers of the book would
Yeah,
pick that up.
yeah, the page before they would have got that who Henry was.
Okay, so one thing that really jumped out at me about this was all the foods you mentioned. Because I actually was asked to write, I call it not a cookbook, based on the scenes in my book with all their food. And so I was interested in your reaction to learning some of the things that they ate, because their diet was very different from ours.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at first I wasn't very interested in the foods and that, but when I started reading about it, I suddenly thought, these are some amazing recipes here. And some of the weird things I ate, like a porpoise or something, and
Yes.
of course the whole thing about the peacock and its feathers, and there's just some really unusual foods that they had. And of course I take my all from actual menus. I mean, there's some very good menus from the 15th century. One was George Neville's inauguration banquet when he became the Bishop of York, Archbishop of York, and that all exists with everything they had to eat. And then also Richard III's coronation feast, that also still exists with what was served.
That's amazing. And did you know that those were available, or did you just stumble on those menus?
I stumbled on them, just looking for other things. I mean, when I first I said I'd always liked Sharon's book about Richard, and when they actually found Richard in what was it? Gosh, it must be 2012, 2013 now, yeah. And there was an exhibition at a stately home near us, which the owners actually had some of Richard's original books that he'd owned as a young man. And then they had one of the coronation banquet menus. And I went there to have a look at it. And I just couldn't believe it was that age, because it had little embossed white boars on it. It just looked so weirdly modern. But yes, but anyway, they had all the lists of the banquets. So that's why I knew that these things existed then. So I was able to, dig a bit deep, find some a bit from earlier periods, find some from other, there were a few cookbooks at the time.
Right. Now, one thing that I think any author can run into a kind of pitfall, but I think especially historical fiction, is we do gather all this incredible information, and there's a tendency, I want to share it all.
Yeah.
What is your advice to other authors? How to sprinkle in all this amazing stuff you've learned without the information dump?
Yeah, I think that the best way to get to important things into there without overdoing it is to try and intersperse it with dialogue and what people are doing. Keep the action going as much as you can around the things that you're also trying to tell people.
Okay. I would like to hear more about Henry Holland. He was the Duke of Exeter, and
Yes,
how
that's
did
right.
he, it was an arranged marriage, so
Yeah.
how did he become so hideous? What kinds of things did he do, and what was his eventual end?
Yes, eventual end. Let me just check again to see exactly. He did so many things.
It's
Yeah,
hard to pin down just one.
Yes, he was in the Tower of London for a while. They say he invented the Duke of Exeter's daughter, which was the rack. Now that may not be actually true, but he was quite violent and he was considered to be a traitor. When Edward IV came onto the throne, he said that, of course, so that's Edward who's mentioned in my story. Exeter went into exile at that point and was floating around penniless for a while. So he came back a bit later on, and I think he did meet a sticky end. I think it was actually after the Battle of Towton that he was killed. I can find out that in a minute. I can't quite remember the exact battle that it was, but yeah, he met a sticky end. But he was not liked by his own side either. Both sides were not friendly to him.
That's quite an accomplishment. To be hated by everyone.
Yeah, that
your own
nobody
side.
liked him. Yeah, so they're almost just described everywhere as cruel and violent.
Yeah. You were born in Canada. What led you to moving to England?
Well, right, yes, well, that's an interesting story. My mother was English. She was a war bride. She married a Canadian soldier and went out to Canada after the war. And she was only very young. She was 17 when they got married. My brother and sister came along when she was 19 and 20. And then we went on for a while. My parents actually weren't getting on. They split up. She went back to England again. And then after about 6 years, my dad thought, oh, I really regret this. And he actually wrote to her and said, can we try again? So she went to Canada again. And that's when I came along.
Surprise!
So I had dual citizenship of both places. So I've probably actually lived slightly longer here in the UK now. Moved a few different places, Northampton first, then Wiltshire now. So I still have some family back in Canada, nieces and nephews.
Did you arrive in England then as a child, or were as more of an adult?
No, I was born over on Vancouver Island on the west coast, but I do remember coming to England when I was 4. That was my first, and my grandmother and my aunts and uncles. And I remember, weirdly enough, this is probably why I went to my first castle, and I can still remember it as clearly as if it was yesterday. And I was only just fourth birthday. It was called Guildford Castle, and then I also went to Windsor as well. So I remember those two right from very, very early on.
And I think that's typical of kids who have very unusual experiences, because I spent my first almost 6 years in Germany. And so, my parents took me to castles, they took me to the Alps, they took us to Spain to a bullfight. And I was probably 4. I can still vividly remember. This was one of the bullfights where the bull caught the matador. And I still have a vivid image of the matador on his back, nose to nose with the bull. And the bull was not happy.
Oh, my.
But, and I had nightmares that night about, I thought we were all given the little red carnations, and mine got to the bottom of my sleeping bag and got really hard. And for some reason, I was convinced it was the bull's nose in the bottom of my sleeping bag, which is completely irrational. I can only say I was 4. So
yeah.
I I did want to ask, I'm not familiar with Richard's older brother. Which Richard are we talking about?
Okay, we're
That your
talking
book is
Richard the
about?
Third. He
Richard
had
the Third. Okay.
yeah, he had two older brothers. Well, no,
Mhm.
actually three. Sorry, three living ones. Though Edmund, the one I'm writing about now, and my work in progress, it should be out in a few
Mhm.
weeks. He was the second brother. But yes, Edward the Fourth is the elder brother. He's 10 years older than Richard the Third. And then
Okay.
Edmund is only 1 year younger than Edward, so it's almost like
Mhm.
why the two brothers are in the story together. Then there was another brother called George. He
Okay.
was the one that was drowned in the vat of Malmsey
Oh
in
my.
Shakespeare. Yes,
Yeah.
which in Shakespeare, Richard got the blame for it. Of course, it was he had nothing actually to do with it at all. It was Edward. It was by the
Mhm.
orders of the king.
Well, one thing I learned studying medieval history is we have this romantic notion of what it was to be a king. We all want to be the descendant of the king and the
Yeah.
queen and the princesses. But the more I studied, I'm like, I don't want to be the king. I don't want to be the queen. Everybody wants to kill you.
I
And
know.
sometimes they succeed.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I always said that if I actually was going to live in the Middle Ages, I probably would choose to be a nun because there's not the fear of dying in childbirth, for instance,
Right, right.
and you get, of course, you can be then educated, and you'll
Mhm.
probably be away. You won't have to worry about being widowed when your husband is chopped up in some battle. So
Right,
there was a
right.
lot of
Well,
advantages to
and
Instead, he was
that's
hung on a cross. But other than that,
yeah, yeah, I don't know.
that's one of the things that I ended up having somebody in my book say was, we think it's so grand to be the king. You get all the luxury and all the best stuff, but you're also the one going into battle, facing the arrows and the swords, whereas the baker gets to stay home with his wife. And is probably going to be a little safer and live a little longer. And nobody wants to kill the baker
Yeah,
unless
well,
he's a
that's a
really bad
very good
baker.
point, actually. Yeah, unless the town is raised by an enemy army or something. But certainly that didn't happen as often. I mean, I have to tell people quite often that Game of Thrones might be based roughly on the Wars of the Roses, but as
Mhm.
horrible as the wars were, they went over about 35 years, but it
Mhm.
wasn't constant fighting, and it wasn't. There was a couple
Right.
of towns that were burnt. Ludlow was burnt. There might have been a few on more in the Midlands as well that possibly
Mhm.
suffered some damage, but it wasn't people marauding through killing everybody in sight.
Right.
That's a
Right.
fantasy. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when I watched Timeline, it seemed like it was everybody killing
Yeah,
everyone in sight.
it looks like that when you look at it, but then when you suddenly realize there were huge gaps of peace in between.
Mhm.
Let's say the Battle of Tewkesbury was 1471. The next battle wasn't till Bosworth, which was 1485. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
quite a
That's
big,
a big
yeah,
gap.
quite a
Well, and
big
of
gap.
course, who's going to write a movie about the time in between?
Yeah.
Here we are sitting at
Families
dinner,
together. Yeah.
having a happy life. Now we're going to go hoe the garden. Now we're going to train the horse. It's not a good story. There's a reason stories
I just
focus on what they do.
I just found the page what happened to Exeter to Henry
Oh,
Holland.
good.
I wanted to make sure I get the right one. I had it in my head that there was someone else who died very similar, so I had to check it was the right one. But yes, he was coming home out of exile. He was being allowed to by King Edward, and this happened on the way back. He fell overboard. Fell
Oh,
over.
no.
he fell overboard.
Yeah, he
Fell
fell.
overboard. With a little help from somebody's very
A
large
little help
butt,
from his
right?
friend. Yeah, so that was how much they wanted to get rid of him.
Well, there are definitely people like that. So I think we are ready for drink 3.
Have to definitely rinse the shaker on that one. We don't want any of that other previous drink to get in the way of this one. Okay, for reading 3, I was I thought it was all fun, the pranks and the running around and Meg not happy with her brothers or whatever it was and all that. So I was like, well, what kind of a cocktail could we have, dealing with pranks and flying fish and all these different things? So the cocktail that we're going to have for reading number 3 is called the Blackberry Raven, which is kind of a novel take on a cocktail that, which could really only be a prank on the person who consumes it. So this is going to be fun. We are going to have, first of all, some Lambrusco wine from Italy. If you've ever had it, it's kind of a little bit of a fizzy, sweet red. And we're going to put that, as soon as I find my container, we're going to put that into the shaker. Then we're going to put a bit of sake in to go with the Lambrusco. Next, we're going to get some Chambord, which is kind of a black raspberry liqueur. And it's a very kind of intensely flavored liqueur. So we're all going to put in just a bit on that one. Now, if we had access to some lychee grapes or lychee juice, we would throw that in. But right now, I'm going to use muscadine juice, which is a little bit of a, somewhat grapey, somewhat floral aspect. So I'm going to put in just a little bit of the muscadine juice. And then we're going to finish it off with just a little bit of lemonade, actually. Normally we'd use a little bit of lemon juice, but we seem to have run out of lemon juice. So at least this is lemony. So I'm going to put that in as well. It shouldn't be too much of an issue. And now we need to shake this. And the Lambrusco is trying to escape because of the little bit of fizziness that it has. This is a kind of drink I like to do a dry shake with some drinks. That's where you take an egg white, you put it over ice, you shake it really hard, and it puts a nice sweet foam on the top of a drink, which is a very nice adjunct to it. But instead, we just have this particular version of it without that. And here we have our Blackberry Raven. I suppose we should come around for the cheers. Our film production company leaves something to be desired.
We're going to fire them all.
That's right.
We're hard-nosed employers.
The Blackberry Raven with pranks and flying fish.
Cheers.
I admit I'm a little afraid to drink a drink that you describe as a prank.
It looks good, actually. It sounds good. What's in it?
It's really got a neat flavor. I would say it's a very classic flavor. That blackberry and the Lambrusco wine is combining. It's almost even a bit of a port-like taste. Say again.
I've had the Lambrusco. That's it's always very nice anyway. Yes.
Yes, it has a little bit of a claret taste to it, I think.
Yes, it does. Actually, which is a very medieval drink, of course, as well.
I'm really tasting the grape juice, and I'm not a fan of grape juice. I mean, it's not bad. I think a lot of people would like this. I was kind of hoping to find a cocktail, or that you would find a cocktail that somehow involved a fish. And I was thinking,
would you like more of this martini?
No. I was thinking of the Bloody Mary we had in Duluth that had 10 or 15 different foods stuck on the stick, one of which was a lobster tail.
Yes. The drink was this tall, all the rest of the ingredients,
So I was thinking of Bloody Mary with a fish head sticking out or something.
I did spare our 10 million viewers from that particular travesty of a drink.
I hear them all thanking you right now. Go ahead with reading number 3.
Okay, reading 3. Richard and George, my little brothers, were running through the halls of Ludlow Castle, thrilled by what this seemed to them, in their innocence, an exciting adventure. I could scarcely believe how big they had grown since I saw them last. George was now approaching 10 summers and Richard almost 7. George had kept his forceful personality and his shaggy head of dusky gold curls. He towed Richard everywhere, explaining this and that as if he was his younger brother's tutor. Richard was quieter and more thoughtful, and his fair baby hair was growing in brown at the roots, much as mine had done at his age. He was shy with me and Ned at first, but that shyness did not last long. Within a week, Ned was sparring with him using a wooden sword, and I took him and George fishing along the banks of the Team. Richard caught the biggest fish and brought it home to present as a gift for Mother, who was missing the usual comforts of the more homely Fotheringay. George managed to extricate its head, goggle-eyed and thick-lipped, from amongst the discarded scraps left after the cook had prepared the fish for table, and mysteriously, it had found its way into my sister Margaret's bed. "You're a beast, George!" She chased him down a corridor, braids flying in the wind of her speed, the offending fish head clutched in her hand. George was too quick and eluded her grabs, so she flung the fish head at him with surprising accuracy for a maiden unused to practicing the throwing skills of boys' ball games. It flopped into the top of his head, and George screamed. Richard collapsed into gales of laughter, as did Edward. "Well aimed, Med," said Edward, wiping his eyes. In the corner, George was grumbling, and Richard began helping him pick fish scales from his hair. Margaret put her hands on her hips, looking very cross. She was 13 now, and was taller than most grown women. She had inherited her height from her ancestor Lionel of Clarence, just as Edward had, but it was more unusual to see in a maiden. "You wouldn't want to tangle with Meg," as she called herself these days. "I do not know how I will survive this winter in the nest of boys," she said, stamping one foot. "Pranks almost every day. Spiders, toads, worms, and molded old fish heads. Noise and squabbling. How I wish our sister Elizabeth was here to give me some relief. I swear I'll write to her and tell her all about your misbehavior."
I thought it was especially funny when I saw goggle-eyed and thick-lipped. I thought that would be a great name for a law firm.
It would.
Change our names and take up law.
Yes,
It's worth it.
yes, just for that. Yeah.
As I read that, my first thought was you either have boys of your own, you've got brothers, or you spend time with nephews.
It was my nephews. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's two boys and one girl. And the poor girl, she used to suffer. She had a very different personality to the two boys. And when I ever had to babysit them, there was always ructions. And sometimes she would cause it, but then and then she didn't like what she got back, if you know what I mean. And all the boys were picking on me.
Right. As you were reading it this time, it's funny how sometimes when I'm reading it, certain things come to mind. When I hear the author read it, other things come to mind. I have 7 boys. I also have 2 girls. And what came to mind was the day. So we lived in a house. It was an okay house. It was kind of a cookie cutter, like millions of them were built in the late 70s. And you came in the front door, went to the living room, went to the dining room, went to the kitchen, eating area, and back down the hall. So you could run in circles all day long if you wanted to. Believe me, boys ran in circles. Well, the problem was I had a harp, I still do, that's very kind of back heavy. And so it's about 5'6", 5'8" inches tall. It's very heavy on the back and it can tip very easily on the carpet. So I had it pushed into the corner of the dining room, but I also didn't want the boys running near it. So I took my couch, I pushed it up against the opening between the living room and the dining room where the harp was. The house looked absolutely horrible. It looked like college students lived there with no idea how to decorate. And it's like, man, I'm an adult, but if I have to live like this to protect my harp, I will. We lived like that for 3 years until I came down the stairs and walked into the living room just in time to see one of my boys plant his hand on the back of the couch and vault over it. And then his brother followed him, vaulting over the couch too. I just stared in shock, and my daughter saw me and she said, "Mom, they've been doing this for 3 years. Don't you know you just made it more fun for them?" I'm like, oh, I'm living in this mess of a house trying to protect my harp for no reason. So the upside was I could at least move the couch and we didn't look so bad anymore.
And is the harp still with you?
The harp is still with me, and it was tucked back in a corner, so they never did damage it, although boys having the sense of humor, they do. I was at the Mall of America one day, and my boys had their friend, oh gosh, if their friend hears this and realizes I forgot his name, he's not going to be happy with me. Anyway, their friend called me, and he's like, my last name was Stack at the time. He said, "Mrs. Stack, I'm hungry." And the guy's in high school. I'm like, okay, so open the freezer and eat something. But Mrs. Stack, I don't know how to work the microwave. I'm here in your house all alone. And the next thing he says is, Mrs. Stack, is your harp supposed to be laying on its side?
Oh,
And at that point, I was like, I know my boys. I said, my harp is not laying on the side. you thought you could upset me. Not going to work. But yeah, I do get a kick out of
It was
boys.
a setup.
It was. And yeah, I think he told me he didn't know how to boil water. I'm like, I know your mom. I guarantee you know how to boil water. So ergo, my harp is not on its side. Yeah. Anyway, as I was reading your scene, I was like, man, that is just like boys. So I was wondering though, as I read, are these relationships historical? Are these the actual children?
these
That
are
he
the
had?
actual children. They all existed. They all became famous people. Some of them, of course, unfortunately, being the time it was, did not meet exactly happy ends. Margaret
Oh,
was
yeah.
quite interesting, Meg. She ended up being the Duchess of Burgundy. And of course, so she lived abroad. Now, she outlived her brothers.
Mhm.
And she proved greatly annoying to Henry Tudor after he seized the throne after the Battle of
Really?
Bosworth.
In what way?
Because the pretenders, who may or may not be who they said they were, she was supporting them, and Perkin Warbeck had actually been at her court. And when he was actually captured by Henry, and Henry had his intentions to execute him, she offered to a huge ransom, and she said, "Oh, it's all fake. It's all fake." But that almost made me think it wasn't fake, because most nobles weren't going to give up their money if they thought, "Oh, he's on to us. He's just got some peasant boy there. Who cares?" She was willing to ransom this boy, whoever he was, young man, for a lot of money.
Okay.
But of course, Henry didn't go for it, so he was executed.
Well,
I do find a relation to this scene, though, a little bit of cosmic justice in that she did outlive her prankish brothers.
Yes, absolutely. Edward lived, actually. I mean, he died of natural causes. He didn't die in battle or anything, but they're not sure really what he died of. He was only 40, coming up to his 41st birthday, and apparently it may have been something like pneumonia, or even as bad as malaria. He'd been fishing a few days before.
Or maybe
and then
Meg pushed him off a boat.
Or maybe, yeah,
time
well,
for you to
definitely had
swim
water
with the
involved. We know that.
So, with all your study of medieval history, and your era is still in the medieval time frame, right? It's the late 1400s.
Yes, that's right.
What would you say is one of the most interesting things you've learned, and what would you say is one of the most important things you've learned from studying history?
Well, it really, when you actually do read it, you really do see that history, it has been written by the victors, and you can't just look at what they've written, but also you need to look at who they are associated with. Like, there's one chronicler who is very sort of down on the House of York in particular, in particular Richard's reign, and this is often used as a main source. However, if you actually look at the patron of his monastery, it was Margaret Beaufort, the Beauforts, who was obviously, she was Henry Tudor's mother. They're also connected with the Duke of Buckingham, who was a rebel in Richard's time. So you got their patrons were not friends with the people, so they're not going to have an unbiased viewpoint. Yeah, another one was Dominic Mancini. He was an Italian spy. Again, I think he gives a relatively good account, but he's only getting his things second and third hand as well, because he didn't speak any English. So
Interesting.
he was having to report back.
Where was he getting his information from?
So it was just anyone who was willing to talk to him, and hopefully there's probably a bit of this involved in it as well. So some of it was half truth, just the mingling. You have to sort of tease out the things and what it might have been, and very strange things, like say about the two pretenders. Oh, Princess in the Tower. The first one was Lambert Simnel, and I mean, even that. I mean, the whole story, and it was just a false boy called Lambert Simnel who found on the battlefield. Henry let him live, but I don't think there was ever a person ever called Lambert Simnel. I've tried to trace the name. It's very, very rare. There seems to be no one in records of that time in Oxfordshire, which is where we're supposed to come from, Oxford. And so I think there's some kind of an in-joke there that we haven't got. With that name is fake. It's and Simnel, of course, is a cake. It's a kind of Easter cake, and
wow.
yeah, so it just doesn't come off as a real name to me. But people have taken it as a real name because it's written down there, and it just doesn't seem to mean anything. So there's some
Right.
people been studying on this right now about the possibility who he really may have been.
That is really interesting. And I think when you consider that people will lie and make up stories today, I have sometimes wondered, will somebody historically years from now, as an example, I made up a whole family history for one of the people in my books because I plan to eventually write stories about his ancestors because it kind of pertains to the book. And I think I used ancestry.com to do it just because they have a system. And then I thought, somebody might think these are real. And 30, 50, 100 years from now, what if they're going, that was my ancestor?
Yeah.
And, I don't know how to find it anymore to remove it. I don't know what my username was.
Well, when I was actually researching, so some of my characters that I've used as well are very, they got a little bit of them on Wiki or whatever, and there's very little about them known. Because especially with my medieval babes series, they're all sort of lesser known medieval women. And I found that same thing. I hit these genealogy sites, and I was getting the weirdest things. People married and having children with their 60s, it just didn't happen.
You're thinking, how does that happen in your 60s? I mean, men maybe, but not women.
Yeah,
so
they saw the name and put the name in without looking at the dates.
Congratulations. You're so fun to talk to that I forgot to watch my timer, and we're on a strict time limit.
Oh dear.
But if you have time, we can stay and talk afterwards. I have more questions, but where can people find you online?
Yeah, I'm still on Twitter. My handle is Stonehenge 2500.
Okay.
I'm also on Facebook, both as Janet Reedman, and also various books of mine have their own pages as well.
Okay.
Where else?
Do you have an author website, a main website?
That's something I've never had a website yet. That may be coming.
And so, Laura, where can we find you?
You can find us at booksandbrews.net. You can find me at lauravosica.com. And you can find our sponsor, Gabriel's Horn, at gabrielshornpress.com. We've got lots of social media. I'm at Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I have an Instagram. You can find me if you really want to. It would take too long to list all of them. Do you have any upcoming events, public events that people can attend?
Yeah, actually, next weekend, I'm at Amesbury History Centre of course, Amesbury in the UK. And I'm going to be selling my books there. It's sort of a craft fair or anything, local people's kind of things that they do. So, and it's quite interesting because it's like a little museum underneath it as well, with all the local finds. Because of course we've got Stonehenge nearby. Avant, who I wrote about my first really very well-selling novel, which is called My Fair Lady. She's actually buried somewhere in Amesbury, and her grave is lost. So I'm hoping one day that they will excavate and be able to find her like they found Richard, and it would probably make me rich.
Right.
So what are our upcoming events or your upcoming events?
We don't have any upcoming public events, but the Gabriel's Horn 2 new poetry anthologies are coming out before the end of December. First will come music, and then will come faith. It's all new poetry in traditional forms.
And so now I'm going
Now.
to guess that you probably have an interesting guest coming up next month. Who could it be?
Do every month I say I'm so excited and I sound like it must be a line because I always say it, but it's always true. And so next month we have John Graham. He has led a very interesting life. I tried to cut his bio shorter. It's like, what do you cut out? He shipped out on a freighter when he was 16.
Well, who doesn't really?
Right. Hitchhiked through, actually, my sister's father-in-law has a similar interesting story. But John Graham hitchhiked through the Algerian Revolution at 19. He was on the team that made the first descent of Denali's North Wall when he was 20. It is a climb so dangerous it has never been repeated. He hitchhiked around the world at 22, working as a correspondent in every war he came across, and it's not like the world is short of wars, unfortunately. A U.S. Foreign Service officer for 15 years, he was in the middle of the 1969 revolution in Libya and the war in Vietnam. As a global peace builder post-Foreign Service, he contributed to peace efforts in Israel and Palestine. For the last 42 years, he has been a leader of the Giraffe Heroes Project, a global movement inspiring people to stick their necks out to solve public problems and giving them tools to succeed. His speeches, blogs, podcasts, and interviews have a global audience. So,
sounds interesting indeed.
Yeah, thank you, John Graham, for making my life look really dull. But I'm excited to have him on and talk to him so I can feel even duller yet. Thank you so much, Janet, for being on.
Cheers.